hard to sum up the life of any individual, especially someone whose life was as long, rich, and varied as Teresa's. Historically, she lived through a period of great change and turmoil all over the world, but especially in China. She came from a well-educated family who, in better times, had been part of the class which made China work. Her father was a controller at the Peking-Hankou Railway, just as China was starting to develop its infrastructure in the early 20th century. They were westernized Chinese, able to work with Westerners and Chinese. At the same time, they were intensely proud of their own Chinese culture. She also came from a family where the women dominated. Her mother ran a large house and household where each of the 10 children had their own nurse and servant. Because her family was large and relatively wealthy, she learned the importance of caring for each other and of helping each other. Because China was going through a period of social turbulence and internal unrest, followed by the Japanese invasion in 1937, she needed to be flexible and learn how to adapt. After the Japanese invaded China and occupied her city and home, the Japanese forced her family to let go of all their servants except for one chef. Her interest in good food and cooking started when she had to start the duty of cooking for her family while learning from the factory cook. Several years later, the oppression of the Japanese occupation was too much for her, when she fled to the Chinese wartime capital of Chongqing, where she taught Mandarin to U.S. military personnel at the U.S. Embassy. At the same time, she helped cook and care for some of her nieces and nephews who had also fled to Chongqing. Some of them are here with us today. At the end of World War II, she moved to Shanghai to work with the United Nations Refugee Relief Association, working as a statistician to help resettle some of the 20 million war refugees. Again, in her spare time, she played the role of caretaker for some of her nephews and nieces in Shanghai, while refining her own cooking skills. Shortly before the communists came to power in China, she fled to Taiwan, where she stayed for a short time before moving on to Tokyo. In Tokyo, she found employment with the American forces fighting under the United Nations flag and fighting the communists on the Korean Peninsula. She became involved in psychological warfare, serving as a Chinese language calligrapher and translator. It was there that she met my father, Paul TeresaDenlinger. After a 2-year courtship, they married in Tokyo at St. Luke's Cathedral. They then moved to Seattle, where my father worked on his PhD in Chinese historical linguistics at the University of Washington. This was where I was born. My father pursued 2 different careers which were somehow complementary. He was an Episcopal priest and member of the Diocese of New Jersey, and he was also a university professor. This dual-track career brought us to many places. We lived in Taipei, Seattle, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Lexington, Kentucky, as well as in California. After her husband died in 1989, she moved from Taipei to San Jose, California in 1998 at the age of 55. The main support community she had until her death was at her church, St. Philip's. There were several strong themes which were part of her personality and her life. She strongly believed that people should do their best and be committed to what they do, no matter how small or big that may be. Not only that, but they should love what they do. Otherwise, what was the point of doing it? She had incredible focus when she did something she loved, whether it was cooking for a banquet or painting a painting. Not only would she do something a certain way, but she could explain to me why it should be done. In her twilight years when I was cooking for her, she would explain to me why it was important to turn a ladle upside down so that any oil clinging would leak away. She believed that God was in the details. To her, it was incomprehensible why anyone would not enjoy cooking. For her, cooking was not just about eating, it was an act of love. It was her way of showing that she cared, and she wanted her guests to be happy. She said to me that all good cultures start with good food, because good conversations start with something good to eat. Otherwise, why would people linger over the table? Eating was a special act, and if people did not enjoy good food, that meant they had no respect for culture. In 2001, while she was waiting for hip replacement surgery and was laid up in bed, I had to cook for her. On one occasion, I did not do a good job. After tasting the food, she said to me, "All my life I have tried to show you what good food is. I can tell from this that I have failed at everything. I never felt quite so small in my whole life." On her last day, she prepared a list of foods she wanted me to buy. The ingredients included crab, egg, green onions, and noodles. I looked at the list and said, "Mom, I don't think you can eat this right now." Then she said to me, "This is not for me to eat. This is for you to eat. You need to eat decent food." To the very end, she was thinking about us, not herself. Throughout her life, culture was very important to her. Right till the end, she thought of herself as a Chinese and was determined to live and die as a Chinese. To her, she was a Chinese woman who had married an American man, but she did not consider herself an immigrant. It took her 13 years to become an American citizen because she was happy just being a Republic of China citizen. In spite of the fact that the communists came to power and that many of her family suffered under the communists, she saw beyond that. She saw China as having a tremendously rich and deep history and culture, and accepted that there would be ebbs and flows in which she personally did not fare well. But she accepted all that and was confident that the culture and people would rise again. This ability to separate cultures, peoples, and governments meant that she could forgive the Japanese for their invasion of China and their atrocities. For her, it was the Japanese government of the time who were bad, but the Japanese people were not guilty. She refused to let anger and hatred of anyone make her a prisoner. Instead, she looked at the circumstances of the time. During her life, she had the opportunity to meet people from many different social classes, including the President of the Republic of China in Taiwan, who my parents had worked with during the Korean War. She also had the opportunity to cook a banquet for General Douglas MacArthur while he was heading the U.S. occupation government in Japan. But to her, they were just ordinary people who happened to have high social and political rank. While many of her relatives and friends sided with the nationalists, and although she counted some leading Chinese nationalist government officials as friends, she also had family relatives who were communists. In 1993, after more than 40 years of separation, we met them in Shanghai and Beijing. Even though they had chosen different sides, they were able to speak to each other with cordiality and with warmth. The Chinese have a very good saying, 求同存异. This means that we should seek common ground, but also respect each other's differences. We should connect, but we don't need to see everything the same way as long as we respect each other. Teresa's life was all about building this kind of respect, even in very difficult circumstances and challenging times. She was able to do all this with grace, style, and flair, which are very hard to find. I have lost a wonderful mother and great teacher, and we have all lost a good shepherd. While we all mourn her passing, we should all be grateful for having experienced her presence. There are some photo albums in the back, and I hope you have the opportunity to look through them at the end of the service.